Also, that beautiful water fountain there, that's known as the Milos Centennial Fountainhead water cannon. The water cannon is the little pyramidal structure right up in front of the fountain, and for the first 10 minutes of every hour of the day, it fires an enormous blast of water across. To make matters a whole lot worse, at the time, the river flowed out into the lake. Well, Lake Michigan was, in the 1880s, and it still is today, our city's source of drinking water. So as you can imagine, in the 1880s, the drinking water was no good at all. So contaminated that about 2,000 people per year were dying due to waterborne illness. So something had to be done, and the solution they devised was to build the Shippen Sanitary Canal. 28 miles across the Mid-Continental Divide. They built it to link the Chicago River to the Des Plaines River, which in turn flows into the Illinois River, the Illinois into the Mississippi, and eventually that water ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. So they're trying to get the pollution as far away from the lake as they possibly could, and they did it in less than a decade, and it also required more land excavation than the building of the Panama Canal. When the Shippen Sanitary Canal opened on January 2nd of 1900, this river effectively reversed its course and started flowing backward and away from Lake Michigan. And then it only took a very short amount of time for the quality of the city's drinking water to dramatically improve, the exact effect they were hoping to have. The reversal architect Mies van der Rohe for a building he proposed for the city of Berlin in 1928. He never ended up building that structure. However, a couple of his students years later found the plans and received his permission to enlarge upon the design. So his student Shipwright and Heinrich, they came up with that. They finished that building in 1968 at 70 stories. First time in the world a building has ever been shaped like that. And it's shaped like that for a pretty good reason. Because of its shape, nobody from one condo can look into another one. So even though you have a building made almost entirely of glass and steel, you're also not going to have any idea whatsoever what your neighbors are doing next door. So it worked out very, very well. Now, I was just speaking a little bit about the reversal of the Chicago River. What I haven't told you yet is about the lock. We're heading on into the Chicago Lock, and this was built in 1938. It was really built out of concern from other cities and states, because after we had finished the Shippen Sanitary Canal, the surrounding cities and states, they started thinking that Chicago began pulling way too much unchecked water off of Lake Michigan. So they got together and they filed a joint lawsuit against Chicago and Illinois. The end result of the lawsuit was to build the lock. The lock here, it allows for governmental control over exactly how much water is taken from Lake Michigan. Now, it also serves another very, very important purpose. It acts as a huge elevator. Chicago fire. Almost everything else burnt to the ground. Inside there you have a huge shopping mall, our city's water tower, which was actually one of the few structures left standing after the Great Chicago Fire. Almost everything else burnt to the ground. Inside there you have a huge shopping mall. And ended up building an island around his boat. He was a really smart guy. He then convinced all of the contractors who were building these huge mansions for the Gold Coast to dump all of that excavated land also around his boat. Built an island, and since that land appeared on no maps or surveys, he simply claimed it for his own. He started selling lots, and then he started setting up shanties. Because they're busy digging the foundation. The foundation for the structure, it runs so deep that you can take the Statue of Liberty, place her inside of the foundation, and the only thing that you'd be able to see from street level would be the tip of her fort. It's pretty amazing. The way it's constructed is also really neat. It's called tubular construction. Now, if you think about 9 drinking straws that are pulled up to different heights and then bundled together, it'll give you an idea of how they did this. Sears Tower is actually 9 independent 75-foot wide steel tubes, which are all then bundled together. The reason they designed it in this fashion is because the building is so tall that they needed to allow for 18 inches of sway up at the top in any given direction. Say you go to the skydeck on a very windy day and the winds are coming out of the south. The building's going to move 18 inches to the north. And the exact same thing if the winds are coming out of the east, it's going to sway 18 inches to the west. Now, don't tell that story to scare anybody off, even with a little bit of movement up there. Clear days and clear nights. Beautiful, beautiful views of the skydeck and the Sears Tower. Now, if we move to the left of the Sears Tower, there's a shorter building, a very bright white light up at the top. A lot of people refer to this as the birthday cake building or the wedding cake building, but it's actually called 311 Wacker Drive. It was designed by Cole Pedersen and Fox in New York City. This is one of the world's tallest reinforced concrete structures. It stands 969 feet up in the air. That has a nickname. It's called the Winter Garden because the lobby is just beautiful. It's full of a whole bunch of different tropical plants. They even have palm trees inside. Definitely worth a walk through if you've never seen it before. One thing about those palm trees, though, they are embalmed palm trees. We have huge temperature extremes here in the city. Really, really hot summers, very, very, very cold winters, and none of the palm trees could survive those temperature extremes. They brought in 3 or 4 different batches at the time the gardener got frustrated with the whole affair and involved with so we didn't have to deal with it. They still look living. They look very pretty. If you've never seen, definitely worth seeing. Also, that bright white light is lit with 1,600 fluorescent light bulbs every night. You can see how bright it is. Okay, folks, so as we make our turn, if you look out on your left-hand side, this is a really good view of Chicago's museum campus. The first building that you'll see, that circular building with the domed roof, that's the Adler Planetarium. The planetarium was a gift to the city by Max Adler. Max Adler was the former vice president of the Sears Roebuck and Company. Inside the building, they have machines called the Adler machine, and it's capable of reproducing star patterns of any age at all. It projects them up onto what they call the theater in the sky. Definitely cool thing to check out if you're going to be here for a while. I'm going to wait till the smoke turns just a little bit. I want to be able to film everything. Building. It's not in view yet, but it'll be coming into view in just a couple of seconds. And it's the Field Museum. That's actually where Mr. Marshall Field was able to build. Remember, he originally wanted to build inside of Grant Park, wasn't able to do that, so he ended up building behind the Shed Aquarium. You'll see how massive the structure is in just a second as soon as it comes into view. And I'll tell you before we can see it, and it's my favorite museum here in the city. If you want a recommendation, if you only have time to go and visit one museum while you're here in Chicago, that would definitely be my recommendation. But I'm a history buff, so it has to be my favorite museum. I had the privilege of giving a tour one time, a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, to the woman who was the head of the archives for the Field Museum. Now you can see it coming into view. It really is just a huge structure, and she told me, even though it was so big, they owned so many different historical artifacts, that they were only able to display, with how big the building is, 1/2 of 1% of everything that they owned. That's all the museum could house. The rest of it was on loan to other museums and universities throughout the world, otherwise it was in storage. So I thought that was just a really unbelievable figure, but that's coming from the head of the archives of the Field Museum, not from me. I hardly believed her when she told me herself. So what we're going to do is turn into the harbor here. We're going to take you up to Buckingham Fountain. You can see the fountain up close until we get there. I'm going to turn the microphone off because I have a story to tell you about Buckingham Fountain, but I'd like you to be able to see it as I'm telling you the story. If you look to its left, there's a shorter building with a pyramidal roof. That's the Prudential 2 building. It was built in 1990 by Lobel, Schlassman, and Happel, and they actually built it to resemble the Chrysler building in New York City. Next to it is the original Prudential building. You can see that rectangular building with the word Prudential on the side. Very tall white antenna. That building from 1950 until 1965, it was the tallest building anywhere in the entire city for 15 years. So it really gives you an idea of how much building has been going on here since 1965. They even had an observation deck up at the top of the Prudential building called the Top of the Rock. So what we're going to do here, we're going to make our way back to the Chicago Lock. This time the process will be reversed. We're going to be lowered back down to the level of the river. We're going to go into and do a little bit more of a river tour. This is a little choppy out here, so it'll get a little bit more architectural once we get out onto the Chicago River once again. So again, I'm going to turn the microphone off, sit back, relax, ask me your questions if you have them, and I'll pick the tour up in a couple of minutes.
Here! I'll hear talks like that. Taking off over there. Contact's already down. 3 down.
She was going to lock the door on him and they'd have to find somewhere else to sleep for the night. So on October 8th of 1871, she had 2 boarders, ridiculously late getting home. They were locked out, had to find somewhere else to stay. So they came up with the brilliant idea of breaking into the O'Leary's barn. Broke into the barn, had a couple of drinks, a few drinks too many. They tossed a lit cigarette into the hay, effectively starting this huge fire. Considered the hub of the lumber industry, the sidewalks, the streets, the houses. So it went up really, really quickly. It burned for 2 days and nights, and while the fire was burning, all the residents were really hoping that the river was going to catch fire. In 1871, the Chicago River was really polluted. So polluted that when the flames reached the river didn't stop the fire, caught on fire, and it acted like a huge wick. We had really strong southwesterly winds over those 2 days. Winds picked the flames up off the water, blew them all over town, and almost every single structure in the entire city burned completely to the ground. Now, in a lot of ways, of course, it was a horrible thing, but for the architecture here in the city, it really actually worked out rather well because the city was, of course, completely to the ground and was considered a blank slate for all of these famous architects that ended up traveling here to rebuild the city, and that's why we have actually one of the most architecturally significant cities anywhere in the entire world. So that's the story about how the Chicago fire really started. Also, that was what I was telling you about, that water, that spray of water there, that is the water cannon. I told you a little bit about that as we were making our way out to the lock in Lake Michigan. So as soon as that water cannon goes off, we're going to head back downriver. I'll talk about some more of these buildings that we're seeing along the Chicago riverfront here. Yeah, that's it.
Answer your question. Next question.
Okay, that little setback passed us, but 10 minutes off. Modernists were trying to get away from was just the modern style, that glass box type structure. So they borrowed very heavily from other styles of architecture. This one borrows very heavily from the Art Deco style, which was very prevalent throughout the 1920s. People refer to this style as Echo Deco because it's echoing, it's mimicking the Art Deco style of design. I'm going to show you a specific Art Deco building a little bit later on in the tour. Now next to it, the one with the glass face here, this is the University of Chicago's Graduate School of Business. It was designed by architect Dirk Lohan. He's kind of been criticized. No windows on the one side at all. That's where every single one of the lecture halls are located. Professors said they didn't want windows there because they didn't want sunlight to interfere with any audiovisual equipment. We think they just didn't want their students looking out of the windows rather than paying attention, but they say it's for the audiovisual equipment. And then we're going to move on to the Tribune building here. This beautiful structure, both Art Deco and Gothic in its design. This is home to the Chicago Tribune newspaper and WGN. Was the winning design of an international competition sponsored by the paper back in 1922. The winners were architects Hood and Howells. Now embedded around the walls of the building, you have pieces of other famous structures like the Great Wall of China, the Berlin Wall, the Taj Mahal, Westminster Abbey, the pyramids. I could go on, but I won't. If you want to know what's embedded around the walls, you can take a walk around the outside. They have everything labeled for you. It makes for a really, really interesting walk. Now, as we leave the Tribune building, then we have the Wrigley building here. This was done in two different sections in the 1920s by Graham Anderson, Probst & White. The South Tower, the one with the clock tower, was such a successful real estate investment when it was completed in 1922 that they added the North Tower in 1924. It's faced with 6 different shades of white terracotta. The terracotta becomes lighter as your eyes travel up to the top. They did that on purpose, wanting everybody to focus on the beautiful top portion. The thing about terracotta, it's fireproof. Everybody was really concerned, obviously, with fireproofing after what happened in 1871. But even though it's fireproof, it's really fragile, and it's so fragile that terracotta can never be power washed. That huge building is literally hand washed every few years with a mild soap solution. So on the right day, you'll see a whole bunch of people up there scrubbing by hand the Wrigley building. It's quite a sight to see. And then you have a huge construction zone next here on our right. That's formerly where the Chicago Sun-Times building stood. It's been torn down because Donald Trump is building his 92-story Trump International Tower here in this location. It's going to end up being the second tallest building in the city of Chicago. Mixed use, you'll have commercial, retail, residential tenants inside. He's getting help from senior design partner Adrian Smith of Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, and they say the building is going to be finished around 2007. So he has a pretty prime spot for his structure right between the Wrigley building and another very famous building here behind it, that tall black structure. 52-story IBM regional headquarters was the last building designed by Mies van der Rohe, remember the father of modernism, before his death. No ornamentation on this or any building at all that Van der Rohe designed. He said everything he put up was supposed to be a tribute to the machine age, so he didn't need any ornamentation. The thing about his IBM building, a couple of things. First of all, the building is supported by caissons that are 7.5 feet in diameter. They travel 130 feet down into the bedrock. Also, you have what are called double pane windows. They create a thermal break. Thermal breaks keep the outside wall completely separate from the inside wall in order to protect all the sensitive computer equipment that they have housed inside there. Now, after IBM, these two completely different looking, the two twin 61-story towers of Marina City. These were designed by architect Bertrand Goldberg, who was incidentally a student of Mies van der Rohe's. You can see how drastically different he interpreted his designs though. Down at the bottom there's a boat marina, then the two condominium complexes. It's also home to the House of Blues Club and Hotel. Mr. Goldberg referred to his condos as tree houses. So you have the cores of the buildings as the trunks, the beams make up the branches, and the balconies are supposed to be the leaves. Use right angles as seldomly as he possibly could. Now also here folks, if we switch over to our left hand side, there's a gorgeous structure here with the silver reflective glass. This is 77 West Wacker Drive. It was designed by architect Ricardo Bofill. Granite base, granite column. It was designed by George C. Nimmons, originally to provide a home for all of Chicago's wholesale grocers. Now you have all commercial space inside. And if you take a look at the outside of the building, notice there's a whole lot of emphasis placed on the horizontal aspects of its design. And that's what's called a prairie style influence. Although not a truly prairie style building, in order to be considered prairie style, you have to structure of 3 stories or lower. You want to be outside of the building. Notice there's a whole lot of emphasis placed on the horizontal aspects of its design. And that's what's called a prairie style influence. Although not a truly prairie style building, in order to be considered prairie style, you have to structure of 3 stories or lower. You want to be something else significant architecturally about this parking garage. So the reason I always like to mention it is because it was built in the 50s. It really gives everybody a great idea of how we treated the legal back then. There's no attention to the all over the place. Most of us the bottom portion is used by pedestrian and automotive traffic, and as you see, the top portion by the City of Chicago's elevated train. That train is commonly called the L. It's the L that gives the downtown business district its nickname. Our nickname is the Loop. That's simply because the train it forms a circle around the business district, so that's where the Loop comes from. Also then, we can't leave out the Merchandise Mart here on our right. This was built in 1929 by Graham Anderson Probst and White. They built it for $38 million for Marshall Field, and it originally consolidated 14 wholesale warehouses of Marshall Field Company. Huge. It has over 4.5 million square feet of floor space, the largest building anywhere in the world square footage-wise until the Pentagon was completed. Now, it was built for Marshall Field. He had a great idea. This great idea was paired with some awful timing, because right after the building went up, stock market crashed, and then he was forced to sell it. Sold it for only $13 million to the Kennedy family. Kennedy family ended up doing a whole lot better with it. When they sold it 10 years ago, they sold it for $575 million. So 13, sold it for $575. Another thing I do want to mention, well, first of all, the next building there, it's called the Apparel Mart. It was built in 1977. It's become, as you can see, the new home for the Chicago Sun-Times. Their old building's been torn down, so they're working up here now as well. Even more interesting, I think, though, is this tiny little landmass up in front of the Apparel Mart. It wasn't always a parking lot. It's really significant to Chicago's history. That little piece of land is known as Wolf Point. That's where in 1822 the first hotel in our area went up. It was known as the Saguenay Hotel. And inside the Saguenay in 1833, that's where the vote was taken to create a town called Chicago. They named it Chicago because all of the Native Americans who lived around here called the whole region Chicago. But what the gentlemen who were taking the vote failed to understand is that all of the Native Americans were referring to the smell of the onions in the soil. And we translate our Chicago means literally the whole region. That's what the Chicago was going to participate in. You'll also see here out on your right the North Branch of the Chicago River. We won't be touring it tonight. This branch, it used to be highly industrial. It's done almost a complete 180. It's fully residential these days. I was telling a couple of people, some of these buildings are really expensive to live in. Studio condos can start around $500,000. Huge X racing on the outside. That one's now Union Station's Health Club, but it was built originally to house the Mercantile Exchange. Now the traders who at one time worked inside there, they used hand signals. So they couldn't lay down any caissons because that would interrupt the traders' view of the boats from the Chicago River. So I'm going to let you guys enjoy your view here until we come out from underneath that next bridge. Oh, really? This one right here? This one I don't have anything on it. Sorry. Okay, one building that I do want to point out to you guys, coming up here with the orange lights, it has that tall silver statue up at the top on your right-hand side. That's a Board of Trade building. It was done in 1930 by Halliburton Road. You'll see it again as we come out from the bridge. Board of Trade is considered the world's busiest grain market. So the statue up there, that's a statue of Ceres. She's the Roman goddess of grain. Now from 1930 until 1955, it was the tallest building in the city for 15 years, and then the Prudential came along and was built a little bit higher than this one. Now even though it was the tallest for 15 years, a lot of people still think that the architect was a bit short-sighted, because when he put Ceres up on top, put her up there without a face. He could not fathom that anyone would ever build taller than 25 stories, so he thought, why would you need a face? Nobody's going to be able to tell the difference one way or another. Not the tallest building at all, not even close to being one of. So from a whole bunch of different vantage points throughout Chicago, you can see that she's up there without a face. And then quickly, this next building, pinkish in color with the bright white light, we saw that from Lake Michigan. That's a closer view of 311 Wacker Drive. Cone Patterson and Fox did this one in 1990. Remember, it's one of the tallest reinforced concrete structures anywhere in the world, 969 feet tall. Told you, again, beautiful, beautiful garden inside, the Winter Garden. So if you've never walked through there, it's definitely worth taking some time to walk through. Really beautiful. Now that one's going to disappear. Michigan, you'll really be able to appreciate how massive building is as it comes into view here. Armchair building. For obvious reasons, it looks like a huge armchair facing westward. Now the story behind the nickname is that when the building went up, it was an absolute financial disaster. So a utilities tycoon named Sam Insel, he gave half of the money that was needed for it out of his very own pocket. So local legend contends the reason he did that was because his wife was an opera singer and she had done really well here in Chicago. Didn't make way for Donald Trump's new building. This is a precursor to modernism. This is how modernism actually got its start. So that's why it looks the way in which it does. Now we're going to leave Morton Thiokol behind. The next building is coming up here on our right that I want to talk about. Constructed in its place, there was a hastily constructed wooden convention center. And it was known as the Wigwam. The Wigwam is where the Republican National Convention of 1860 was held, where Abraham Lincoln was nominated as the 16th president of the U.S. So very, very historic site. Also the first building along the Chicago River to put some green space up in front to really embrace the Chicago River, so it's really known for that as well. Now that'll do it for the South Branch. Beautiful examples of what's called contextual architecture. And that means that the architect is trying to complement the surroundings the building goes up in. So 333, the green glass was chosen specifically because of the color of the Chicago River. And the bend in the face of the building complements the curve that we're on here on the water. Spandrels, and what they do is they create vertical lines that are going to draw your eyes all the way up to the top. A lot of emphasis was always placed on the vertical aspects of Art Deco because it was the first time people were ever able to build so high. So they wanted everybody to look up and see the top of this building. There is actually a similarity between it and the Parthenon, and that's what the architect Ricardo Bofill was going for. He wanted everybody to notice the similarity. We've taken to calling it the Parthenon on a stick because of how skinny it is, but there is definitely that similarity to it. It's another just great view of that building, and as we leave it behind, you're going to see another one. The river. When he did that, the river was classified as toxic, and he did his own stunt, so there's life in danger in a couple of ways. But yeah, that was him in the movie that actually drove his own car off of the parking garage there. So that's Marina City. Let's see, we have a couple more buildings to get to here. The next one is going to be on your right. In 1996, it was declared a Chicago Historical Landmark. It's beautiful. It's called the Jewelers Building, this beige structure that's going to start coming into view. Designed in the 20s by Thielbart and Fugard, and it's meant to resemble a 15th century Italian monastery. The top domed center portion up there, that's called a belvedere. Belvedere means beautiful view. 4 smaller domes, those are known as Tempiettas. Right now, the top dome, it's occupied by architect Helmut Jahn. He has a showroom up at the top. A long time ago, though, it was run by someone else who originally claimed to be running a furniture store. Eventually, people started getting wise and realizing, he probably doesn't have anything at all to do with furniture, because they realized what his real name was. His name was Al Capone. Al Capone was not running a furniture store up there. He was running a speakeasy during Prohibition. He got away with it for a good few years before people started recognizing what his name was. So I think he picked one of the most beautiful buildings anywhere in the city to do that. It's one of my favorite stories about old-time Chicago. And also a very thin, light tan building here on our right. That one's 75 East Wacker Drive, done by Herbert Riddle in 1928. It's called the Neo-Gothic style of architecture. Now originally in 1928 when Mr. Riddle finished with it, this stood as the tallest building anywhere in the entire world. Now it didn't have the title for very long at all. It was only the tallest building in the world for about 2.5, 3 weeks. But had the title for a little while. You have to give it a little bit of credit for that. It was the tallest building in the world for